Have you ever heard of an object capable of defying the logic of time? Well, before we begin, tell me, are you subscribed to the channel yet? If not, take advantage now, that way you won't miss any of the mysteries we investigate together. And if you could leave a like and a comment, it would really help these stories reach more people who, like you, aren't satisfied with easy answers. What I'm about to reveal today has divided opinions for over a century. For some, it's merely an exaggerated superstition. For others, it's one of the strongest proofs that there are forces that science still can't explain. Imagine a clock that, instead of marking the advance of time, insists on turning backwards, and with each movement, brings with it mysterious deaths, psychological breakdowns, and even unsolved disappearances. Sound unlikely? Perhaps, but that's precisely what makes this story so disturbing. Throughout the investigation, I found hidden records, frightening accounts, and even official documents that attempted to be erased from history. The most curious thing is that the watch didn't remain in the past. It still circulates, hidden among collectors, leaving a trail of tragedies in its wake. If you believe that time is a straight line, perhaps this case will change your perception forever. Well, get ready, because today we're going to delve into one of the darkest enigmas ever recorded, the case of the clock that runs backward. And I need to warn you, the more you know, the harder it will be to look at the second hand the same way again. I clearly remember the first time I heard about the clock that runs backward. It was in a forgotten library in a European village where the dust seemed to hide more than just old books. The yellowed pages told the story of a watchmaker obsessed with time, as if each second were an invisible prison. He believed that if he could reverse the course of the hands, he could defy the very laws of life. Perhaps, who knows, even cheat death. This man wasn't known for his friendliness, but rather for the restless look he carried, as if he were seeing something beyond the obvious. They said he spent entire nights surrounded by gears, hammers, and complex drawings, sketching formulas no one could understand. He wasn't just a craftsman, but a troubled visionary. The village whispered, fearing that his fascination with time was actually a form of madness. I've seen this many times in investigations. Genius and obsession go hand in hand. The clock was born, then, shrouded in mystery. Small but imposing, with hands that rotated counterclockwise without ever stopping, as if following their own rules. To some, it was merely a watchmaker's quirk. To others, a cursed artifact that defied the natural order of things. Curiously, while many feared the object, there were those who desired it, believing that controlling time would give them power and advantage. It's amazing how human beings are seduced by what they don't understand. When I discovered this story, I realized it wasn't just a forgotten urban legend. Official documents from the time mentioned a watchmaker's name, albeit with many gaps. It's as if someone had tried to erase his existence. And that kind of silence always screams louder than any record. Something inside me told me the origin of this object was just the tip of a much larger enigma, about to reveal consequences no one could have imagined. It was when the watch left the watchmaker's hands that the story began to take on even darker tones. The first official owner was an aristocrat with eccentric behavior, known for his lavish parties and peculiar tastes. He was fascinated by the inexplicable and soon found himself drawn to this object that defied all known rules. It wasn't long before the watch occupied a prominent place in his mansion, displayed as if it were a rare collector's item. However, the first few weeks already revealed disturbing signs. Servants reported that their master would talk to himself in front of the clock, as if listening to instructions coming from it. The aristocrat began to lose entire nights, sitting motionless before the counter-spinning hands, muttering incoherent phrases. Some swore they saw him smiling into space, as if someone invisible were sharing the moment with him. I've witnessed something similar in other cases. The line between the mind and the supernatural can be more tenuous than we imagine. Little by little, his sanity began to unravel. Before everyone's eyes, he began to hear insistent voices, ordering him not just to watch the clock, but to obey it. Some employees abandoned their work, claiming that the atmosphere in the house had become stifling and heavy. With each chime, something seemed to drain the vitality from the place. Many believed the aristocrat was sinking into delirium, but there were also those who suspected forces beyond rational explanation. The outcome was not long in coming. The aristocrat was found alone, locked in his room, quietly repeating a phrase that no one could decipher. The clock on the table continued to tick backward, oblivious to human despair. It was at that moment that I understood. This object not only defied logic, but also fueled a psychological darkness difficult to name. And curiously, this was only the first piece of the puzzle, before other, even more sinister tragedies came to light. The first deaths associated with the clock occurred shortly after the aristocrat's descent into insanity. These were no ordinary deaths. There was always something strange about the scene. Servants were found lifeless, lying as if they had fallen asleep and never awakened. No sign of a struggle, no apparent cause. It was as if time had simply stopped for them. When I saw the records of these cases, I felt that chill that only appears when we are faced with something beyond the ordinary. The curious thing is that all the victims had one thing in common. They were near the clock hours before their deaths. Some were cleaning the room, others were just passing through the hallway, but this detail was always present. And the stories didn't stop there. Witnesses claimed to hear an irregular ticking the night before the tragedies, as if the clock had altered its rhythm just before claiming another life. It was impossible not to notice the pattern. In investigations, patterns always speak louder than 1,000 words. One night, 3 deaths occurred almost simultaneously in different parts of the mansion: a servant, a housekeeper, and a guest. All young, healthy, with no history of serious health problems. The official investigation claimed natural causes. But let's face it, what an unlikely coincidence, right? It was at this point that rumors gained momentum, transforming the clock into a synonym for a curse. Many local residents refused to even go near the house, fearing being swallowed by that invisible force. The aristocrat, however, seemed indifferent to the tragedy surrounding him. On the contrary, he said that the deaths were merely a price to pay for the wisdom of time. This phrase was recorded in a diary I found in old archives. But what did he mean by this? What wisdom could this be, capable of costing human lives? This was the question I couldn't get out of my mind, and it led me to delve even deeper into the following events. When investigating serial deaths, we always look for a common thread, something that connects the pieces of the puzzle. In the case of the clock, this connection emerged in an almost poetic and frightening way. I discovered that on the nights before each death, the hands would turn back at a faster than normal rate. It was as if time itself were being rewound, preparing to erase another life from history. Witnesses claimed that during these nights, the ticking sound echoed in a distorted way, reminiscent of heavy breathing. It wasn't just the ticking of seconds, but a morbid warning. Some said they could feel the air in the room growing denser and colder, as if the clock were sucking life energy from the room. I've seen strange objects in my investigations, but nothing that transformed the perception of time into something so palpable and sinister. The most disturbing thing was the feeling of inevitability. Anyone who noticed the reverse movement could do nothing but watch, helpless. Imagine seeing time running backward, and at the same time, knowing that it meant someone would soon lose their life. It's the kind of helplessness that scars us forever, because the human mind hates not having control over what's to come. The feeling of inevitable fate is one of the greatest prisons I've ever seen anyone experience. And the aristocrat who owned the clock seemed aware of this. In one of his writings, I found the phrase, "When the hands turn back, a soul must yield." That phrase has stuck with me ever since. It was a pattern, almost a foretold verdict, but no one has ever managed to stop the cycle. And it was precisely this certainty that something greater was at play that led me to suspect an even darker aspect that would follow. It was at this point in the investigation that occultists and psychics began to focus on the case. The clock's fame had already spread beyond the village, attracting curious souls seeking explanations beyond science. Some claimed the object was not just an eccentric contraption, but a veritable time portal. They said the hands, when turned backward, didn't tears time, but opened invisible rifts in reality, allowing strange forces to cross into our world. Others were even bolder in their claims. They called the clock a demonic seal, created to imprison entities that fed on human life. According to them, each death was an involuntary offering, an inevitable exchange to keep the creature behind the gears satisfied. As an investigator, I've learned to respect both logic and the inexplicable. As absurd as it may seem, a theory gains weight when it's surrounded by evidence we can't ignore. I once had access to recordings of a seance conducted by a group of psychics who attempted to communicate with the power of the clock. What struck me most was that, at one point, they all reported hearing the clock ticking backward, even without the object being present. They described whispered voices, promises of power, but also warnings of destruction. The experience left them terrified, and none of them wanted to repeat the experiment. For me, the most disturbing detail wasn't what they said, but what they didn't say. The psychics avoided answering specific questions about the clock's future as if they knew more than they were willing to reveal. And this intentional silence is often a clear indication that something much deeper is hidden. Something that perhaps would begin to connect with official police records that would soon emerge. When I delved into the police records of the time, I found curious reports, full of contradictions. The officers recorded testimonies from servants, neighbors, and even family members who described the clock as something alive, pulsating, almost sentient. However, when it came time to draw up their conclusions, they always used the same excuse: lack of material evidence. As if the inexplicable could be swept under the rug simply because it didn't fit into official reports. I remember one document in particular. The lead investigator described feeling chills upon entering the room where the clock was. He even noted that the air felt heavier and that his perception of time itself changed in the room. However, in his conclusion, he dismissed it all as illusions caused by stress and superstition. I've seen this happen in many other cases. The truth is distorted to avoid challenging common sense or to protect reputations. Despite the formal denial, there were clear signs of fear among the officers. Some refused to return to the mansion, others requested immediate transfer. The head of the investigation himself closed the case hastily, without ever explaining why. This omission has always intrigued me. It's as if there were an order from above, forcing them to close the case before something even more compromising came to light. And it was precisely this rush to silence the matter that raised my greatest suspicion: the watch's sudden disappearance from official records. No document mentioned where it had been taken, nor who was responsible for its safekeeping. The object simply vanished, as if it had evaporated, but in my experience, nothing disappears without a trace. And those traces were about to lead me to an even stranger discovery. What struck me most, reviewing the old documents, was the sudden disappearance of the watch. Officially, it had been collected as evidence during the investigation, but there was no record of where it had been stored. No receipt, no entry in the police inventory. It was as if the object had been swallowed by a bureaucratic black hole. And believe me, when something disappears like that, it's no accident. I've seen evidence compromise investigations in the past, but what happened with this watch was different. This wasn't ordinary corruption, a valuable item being stolen for personal gain. The tone of the reports betrayed something deeper: fear. Those responsible seemed relieved to no longer have to deal with it, as if its disappearance were in some way a relief. But relief for whom? And at what cost? These questions kept gnawing at my mind. It was at this point that rumors began to surface about influential figures interested in the artifact. Nobles, collectors, and even religious leaders allegedly moved their pieces to keep the clock out of the eyes of the law. Some said the object was taken out of the country, others believed it was being used in secret rituals. The lack of official records only fueled these theories. And as always happens in cases like this, the more silence, the more noise it creates. The most disturbing detail, however, is that the disappearances of people connected to the case continued even after the watch vanished, as if it had found new hands, new homes. Physical absence didn't mean an absence of power, and that's how I understood that the story was far from over. On the contrary, it was just beginning to spread like a shadow that respects no borders. Decades passed in silence, and many believed the clock to be nothing more than a legend lost to time. But like every shadow that insists on returning, it reappeared unexpectedly. I discovered reports of the artifact being seen at clandestine auctions, always shrouded in mystery. There were no public announcements, only secret invitations to collectors willing to pay a fortune for something that supposedly carried a piece of the supernatural. Rumors claimed the watch brought immediate bad luck to anyone who dared to buy it. Businessmen went bankrupt days after bidding on it, and entire families were plunged into inexplicable tragedies, yet there was always someone willing to try their luck. as if the possibility of possessing the impossible were stronger than the fear of ruin. This is a fascinating trait of human nature. We seek power even in that which can destroy us. I spoke with a former auctioneer who swore he'd seen the clock twice. According to him, the object seemed to have a life of its own, drawing attention like an invisible magnet. He described the auction atmosphere as heavy and suffocating, and assured me he'd never forgotten the sound of the hands ticking backward, echoing even amidst the voices and bidding. His confession carried the kind of fear you can't invent. I believed him. The curious thing is that, despite reappearing, the watch never remained in anyone's possession for long. It changed hands quickly, as if rejecting its owners, leaving behind only traces of tragedy. This made me wonder, did the watch choose its victims, or were the victims drawn to it? This question opened a new line of investigation that would lead me directly to the psychological effects on its owners. It was while investigating the clock's most recent owners that I noticed an even more disturbing pattern. None of them remained sane for long. The accounts I collected described similar symptoms, as if the artifact had the power to corrode the owner's mind. First came insomnia, then increasing paranoia, and finally auditory hallucinations. They swore they heard voices whispering secrets of time, as if the clock spoke directly to them. A collector reported spending weeks without sleep, obsessed with watching the hands move backward. He claimed the object told him truths about people close to him, revealing betrayals and hidden secrets. But over time, the line between reality and delusion blurred. Friends reported that he began accusing everyone of conspiracy, even his most loyal family members. Shortly thereafter, he disappeared without a trace. Coincidence? I don't believe in so many coincidences. What struck me most was realizing that the symptoms were nearly identical, even in people from different countries and cultures. It was as if the watch had an invisible manual of psychological destruction, programmed to drive its owners to collapse. As a researcher, I've learned that the mind is a fertile breeding ground for the inexplicable. A single spark is enough to transform fear into madness. And this object seemed to be the perfect spark. As I analyzed these cases, a question consumed me. Did the watch truly transmit messages, or were the owners themselves projecting their weaknesses onto it? Perhaps both were true. And this reflection led me to explore another, even darker aspect. The direct link between the artifact and a series of mysterious disappearances that could no longer be ignored. As I reviewed the testimonies of the watch's owners' families and acquaintances, I realized that the deaths weren't the only dark aspect of this story. Whenever the hands accelerated their reverse march, someone close to the owner simply disappeared. There were no clues, no trace of a struggle, nothing. It was as if the person had been swallowed by air, leaving only a harrowing silence behind. A woman told me about her husband, an antique dealer, who had acquired the watch at an illegal auction. She said that in the days before it disappeared, he had become increasingly obsessed with it, barely eating or sleeping. Until one night, after the watch began to spin strangely, he disappeared without even leaving behind the clothes he was wearing. Most disturbingly, the next morning, the hands were perfectly aligned with midnight, as if time had reset itself. This wasn't an isolated case. Young employees, close friends, and even immediate family members disappeared under equally mysterious circumstances. With each record I found, I had the feeling that the watch not only drained the sanity of its owners, but also exacted a toll of life from those around it. It was as if it were spinning an invisible web, choosing its victims as it saw fit. And this reminded me of other cursed objects I've investigated, always with the same pattern. They never affect just the owner, but everyone around them. The inevitable conclusion was that the watch posed a danger, not only to its owner, but to anyone who dared approach. And this explained why so many families preferred to deny its existence, rather than face the stigma of having it in their past. But there was something even more disturbing. Certain disappearances were linked to entire lineages, as if the watch had chosen to haunt specific generations. When I investigated the disappearances and deaths further, I noticed something even more disturbing. Certain families carried a continuous history of tragedies linked to the clock. It was as if the object had marked these lineages, following them for decades, never letting go of its influence. In some cases, the descendants didn't even know of the artifact's existence, but were still affected by its invisible weight. Coincidence? I doubt it. One of the most iconic families was that of the ancient aristocrats, who owned the clock, Entire generations were ravaged by sudden illnesses, unexplained accidents, and unsolved disappearances. Even those who tried to deny the inheritance of this shadowy object ended up reaping the consequences. I remember interviewing an heir who swore he'd never seen the clock, but described recurring dreams of the hands turning backward. Dreams that, curiously, recurred on the same night a distant cousin disappeared. This pattern repeated itself in other lineages that had come into contact with the artifact. It was as if the clock wasn't content to affect isolated individuals. It seemed to feed on blood, extending its influence across generations. In my investigations, I've seen family curses passed down like invisible inheritances, shaping destinies before they're even born. The clock, it seemed, worked exactly like this. A link between past, present, and future, destined never to be broken. And the scariest thing was realizing that some families began to organize secretly to try to hide or even destroy the artifact. But each time someone tried to get rid of it, even greater tragedies occurred. This raised an inevitable question in me. Was the clock simply cursing entire generations, or was someone, behind the scenes, using this curse as a tool of power? Not everyone accepted the idea of a curse. Over the years, physicists and engineers tried to offer a rational explanation for the clock. Some analyzed it as a defective mechanism, a rare piece whose inverted functioning could be the result of asymmetrical gears or unusual wear. But no matter how many times they disassembled and reassembled the object, they found nothing abnormal. The clock seemed to defy even the most basic laws of mechanics. I remember reading a report by a renowned engineer who spent months studying the artifact. He described, with astonishment, how all the components were absolutely ordinary. With no tricks, no hidden alterations, the internal mechanism should have worked like any other clock, and yet the hands moved back precisely, as if obeying some invisible logic. In the end, his conclusion was almost despairing. It's a walking paradox. Interestingly, some scientists began to speculate that the clock might be a magnetic anomaly, influenced by fields we don't yet understand. Others even suggested it functioned as a miniature time machine, though no experiments have proven this. I realized that, even among the most rational, the object provoked rifts. Science tried to account for it, but always hit a wall of impossibilities, and this frustration only fueled the clock's dark aura. After all, if even science couldn't explain it, all that was left was the acceptance that something existed beyond human comprehension. But for some secret groups, this mystery wasn't a cause for fear, it was an invitation to explore new limits. And it was precisely in this context that records of hidden experiments involving the clock began to emerge. It was while investigating confidential documents and accounts from former members of secret societies that I uncovered a new layer to this story. The clock wasn't just observed, it was actively used in occult rituals. Small groups, fascinated by the power they believed to be hidden within the artifact, would gather in basements and secluded mansions, always at midnight, attempting to manipulate fate through its inverted gears. The object, which already inspired fear in many, was seen by these men as a key to rewriting the future. One of the most striking accounts I found described a ceremony in which participants formed a circle around a clock, letting it run backward while reciting ancient invocations. The account said that, at the exact moment the hands returned to their original position, 3 candles extinguished themselves, and one of those present fell unconscious, muttering words in an unknown language. Coincidence? Perhaps. But one cannot ignore the fact that this same man disappeared days later without a trace. Occultists believed that each turn of the clock represented an opportunity to change an already written event, an accident avoided, a fortune gained, a betrayal undone, but there was always a price. Many who risked these rituals reaped even greater tragedies than those they tried to avoid. This reminded me of something I learned early on as an investigator. When we try to control what is beyond our comprehension, we end up being controlled by it. What disturbed me most, however, was realizing that these experiments didn't stop in the past. There's evidence that even today, discrete societies seek the clock, believing it can be used as a tool of power. This suspicion led me to delve into academic controversies, where the discussion about the artifact became a battle between skeptics and believers, each side fiercely defending its view. When the clock began to gain notoriety outside occult circles, it entered the academic radar, and as always happens with topics that defy logic, the debate became a veritable intellectual battleground. On one side, there were historians who saw the object as nothing more than a popular superstition, the result of exaggerations, collective fears, and misinterpreted coincidences. To them, the clock was nothing more than a strange relic, shrouded in myth. On the other side, bolder scholars emerged, willing to consider the hypothesis that something truly extraordinary was at play. Some pointed to the consistency of accounts over decades as evidence that these were not just legends. Others noted that across different eras and cultures, similar stories exist about objects that defy the natural flow of time. The discussion ceased to be merely historical and took on almost philosophical overtones. To what extent is reality shaped by perception? At a conference I investigated, I remember seeing academics arguing heatedly in front of an audience. One argued that the clock was merely a metaphor for the human fear of death, while another argued that ignoring its manifestations was denying documented facts. It was almost comical to see respected intellectuals lose their composure in the face of an object they should never underestimate. The clock had that power to divide even the most rational minds. But the most curious detail was the strategic silence of certain institutions. Museums, universities, and even historical archives seemed to avoid mentioning the watch, as if there were a tacit agreement for it to remain outside the official narrative. This silence, for me, always spoke louder than any discourse. And it was in this academic void that I found clues about an obsessed collector whose story would become one of the strangest chapters of the entire investigation. In the 1980s, the watch reappeared in one of the most talked about stories in investigative circles, that of the millionaire who became its owner. This man, known for his wealth and extravagance, had a particular obsession with rare and controversial artifacts. When the watch appeared at a low-key auction, he didn't hesitate before buying it for an absurd sum. For him, it was not just a historical piece, but a trophy that confirmed his power over the unattainable. In the early days, employees noticed unusual behavior. The millionaire spent hours locked in his office, staring at the hands that turned backward as if hypnotized. He barely spoke, barely. Later reports indicate that he began talking to himself, repeating incoherent phrases about rewriting his life and not letting time defeat him. It was clear that the watch had become more than an object. It was an obsession that consumed every moment of his attention. A few days later, the tragic outcome. The millionaire's body was found in his office, in a strange position, as if he had fallen to his knees in front of the clock. There were no signs of violence, nor any plausible medical explanation. But the most macabre detail was in the employee records. All of them stated that early morning, they heard the clock sound louder than ever, as if each tick were thunder inside the mansion. And, at the moment the boss was discovered dead, the hands were exactly at the starting point. This story spread around the world, but was quickly hushed up. Journalists who tried to investigate the case further encountered closed doors and uncomfortable silences. And for me, this silence screamed an uncomfortable truth. The clock not only remained active, but also seemed to attract precisely those who could not resist the allure of power. But the most intriguing thing was to come, the artifact's direct connection to psychiatric hospitals, where its effects seemed to manifest themselves in an even more cruel way. While investigating the clock's murky history, I came across medical records that intrigued me. Patients admitted to psychiatric hospitals repeatedly reported recurring dreams of a clock whose hands turned counterclockwise. The most striking detail was that many of them had no connection to one another, lived in different regions, and had never heard of the artifact. Yet they described it with eerie precision, as if they had shared the same vision. These reports always appeared just before intense crises. Patients who were in stable condition would suddenly experience violent psychotic episodes, claiming to hear voices coming from the clock or screaming that time was slipping away. In some cases, the crises were so severe that they resulted in self-destruction. What disturbed me most was the constancy. Always the same symbol, always the same artifact, repeated like an invisible mark in the collective subconscious. I spoke with doctors who had witnessed these episodes and noticed a pattern of discomfort in their words. Many preferred to ignore the matter, labeling the reports as delusions typical of schizophrenia or similar disorders, but some, in a reserved tone, admitted they had no plausible explanation. One of them even confessed to me that he had also dreamed about the watch after hearing his patients talk about it, and since then had suffered from constant insomnia. This detail made me question the extent to which the object limited its influence to the physical. The idea that the clock could invade dreams, penetrating vulnerable minds, opened a new line of investigation for me. We weren't just dealing with a material artifact, but something capable of transitioning between reality and imagination, shaping consciousness, and this realization led me to the next, even more disturbing mystery, the emergence of the so-called curse of time, reported by those who were close to the object and survived to tell the tale. Of all the accounts I collected, this is perhaps the most unsettling. The physical sensation that the environment itself transforms when the clock goes into reverse. Witnesses swore that, at these moments, the temperature would suddenly drop, as if a frigid wind were blowing through the room without any windows open. Silence would pervade the space, and even the most ordinary sounds, like the rustling of trees or the distant barking of dogs, seemed to simply vanish. A former servant at one of the owner's mansions described one such experience in detail. He said that while cleaning the hall, he noticed the clock ticking backward. Within seconds, the air became so heavy that breathing felt like an effort. He tried to call for other servants, but his voice wouldn't come out. It was as if time had stopped, not only in the hands of the clock, but also within his own body. When he finally managed to move, he discovered that only 2 minutes had passed, but to him it felt like an eternity. This effect of temporal suspension was repeated in different accounts. Some reported seeing people motionless, stuck like statues, while the clock continued its reverse march. Others claimed that, at these moments, shadows appeared in the corners of the walls, silently observing. As I analyzed the testimonies, I noticed a frightening pattern. The clock didn't just measure time, it seemed to play with human perception of it, as if mocking our fragility in the face of that which we cannot control. This idea of a temporal curse made me think about how many lives have been affected without ever understanding why. After all, how can one fight something that infiltrates the very flow of time? What if the feeling of paralysis was just the prelude to something greater? This was the question that haunted me until I found the records of the original watchmaker, whose disappearance would add a new and sinister layer to the enigma. For months, I searched for clues about the watchmaker responsible for the artifact's creation. His name appeared in parish records, on old invoices, even on tax lists from the time. But at a certain point, he simply disappeared from history. There was no death certificate, no change of residence, or any subsequent mention. It was as if he had vanished, leaving only the watch as a witness to his existence. And that, to an investigator like me, always sounds more suspicious than the death itself. It was then that I found a set of documents in a forgotten library. They were personal notes, fragmented and nearly illegible, but they revealed something disturbing. The watchmaker believed the watch would be his masterpiece, capable of freeing him from the tyranny of time. On one of the last pages, he wrote, "If it works, I will no longer be here." That sentence haunted me for days, like a riddle impossible to ignore. Was he foreseeing his own demise? What intrigued me most was a testimony gathered many years later from a distant descendant. He claimed that, on the quietest nights, he would hear metallic knocks coming from inside the family home, even without a clock nearby, an acoustic legacy of something that should never have existed. This detail made me reflect. What if the watchmaker hadn't simply disappeared? What if he had somehow been absorbed into the creation itself, becoming a part of it? This hypothesis seemed absurd, but at the same time, it made a strange sense. How many times have I seen inventors fall victim to their own obsessions? The watchmaker might have achieved what he desired, to free himself from time, but at the highest possible price, and this revelation led me to investigate the present. For rumors indicated that the watch had not remained in the past. On the contrary, it was once again circulating in the shadows. In recent years, my investigation took an unexpected turn. I discovered that the watch, far from being forgotten, had returned to circulation among obscure collectors. There are no official records or documents proving its recent existence, but the rumors are too strong to ignore. They always emerge in the same way: a private auction, a collector seeking something unique, and soon after, inexplicable tragedies involving the new owner. The pattern is eerily consistent. On my travels, I spoke with brokers of rare artifacts. Some denied knowing anything, but their eyes betrayed fear. Others were more frank, describing the watch as a piece that no one wants to keep for long. One of them told me, almost in a whisper, "This object gets rid of its owners. It belongs to no one." It was the first time I realized the extent of its autonomy, as if the watch chose where to go. The curious thing is that the more I try to track it down, the more it seems to hide. It's like chasing a shadow that never quite captures itself. Some clues led me to luxurious mansions, others to abandoned warehouses used as clandestine meeting places. But I never found the artifact itself, only traces of its impact. Families torn apart, collectors in ruin, inheritances tainted by the inexplicable. The watch, somehow, always eludes me by a thread. This difficulty in tracking it down made me realize something. Perhaps the object isn't just a cursed piece, but rather an active player in this story, as if it had a will of its own, moving around the human board according to its own interests. And this conclusion prepared me for the final and perhaps most disturbing point of the investigation, the enigma that, to this day, no one has been able to solve. After delving into so many accounts, archives, testimonies, and legends, I came to an uncomfortable conclusion. The clock remains an absolute enigma. Each clue I uncovered seemed to raise even more questions, without ever providing me with a definitive answer. Some swore it was all a well-crafted hoax, created to stoke collective fear. Others steadfastly defended the object as supernatural, an artifact that should never have existed. The most intriguing thing is to understand how the clock, regardless of its origin, shaped the lives of hundreds of people over more than a century. If it was a fraud, how can we explain the overlapping reports, coming from different places and times? If it was merely a figment of the imagination, how can we justify deaths, disappearances, and mass outbreaks? And if it was supernatural, why was it, a simple clock, chosen to carry so much weight? Questions that persist in having no answers. Personally, I've seen cases where the human mind creates monsters out of fear. But I've also encountered phenomena that simply don't fit into any rational explanation. The clock seems to sit on that threshold, between reality and hallucination, between science and superstition. Perhaps that's what makes it so fascinating and so dangerous at the same time. After all, what scares most is not what we know, but what we can never fully understand. And so, this artifact continues to elude definition. Fraud? Curse? Collective psychology? Or a window into something greater, something we're unprepared to face? I don't have all the answers, and perhaps no one ever will. What I do know is that as long as the clock continues ticking in the shadows, the mystery will remain alive, and inevitably, more dark stories will be written in its name. Now that you know the secrets of the backward-running clock, tell me, how far would you be willing to go in search of answers that logic can't provide? Would you face such an object, knowing that every second could cost you something you'll never get back? Or would you rather believe that certain doors should remain closed? These questions don't have a single answer, but that's precisely what makes this case so intriguing. The truth is, mysteries like this remind us of something important. We don't always control time, but we can choose what we do with it. And perhaps that's the most valuable lesson behind this dark story. And I want to hear from you. What part of this investigation gave you the most chills? Do you believe the clock is just a figment of your imagination, or do you think there's actually something supernatural behind it? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Before you leave, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like it. This way, you can continue following investigations like this and not miss any details of the next mysterious cases I have to share. After all, some secrets can't and shouldn't be forgotten.